And thank you for having me here to Coconut Theatre and to Chai Wai and Rangmash. My name is Ingrid Fiksdal, and I work as a choreographer based in Oslo in Norway. And nice to see you all here. I will start to tell you a little bit about my background as a dancer and choreographer. I will then move on to talk a little bit about artistic research within the PhD format in Norway. And then I will give some examples from my performance Diorama, which is a performance that has toured now to 21 cities around Europe and North America. I started to train as a dancer in 2004, and I studied in Leeds in England in a school called Northern School of Contemporary Dance. And this was focusing a lot on, I guess, American techniques, so Graham technique, Cunningham technique, summer release technique. And we also had a possibility to choose choreography as an option there. And I realized during this BA program that choreography was my main interest. And I continued to a master's program in choreography in Oslo at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. And I graduated there in 2006, and from then I started to work as a freelance choreographer based in Oslo and also working around Europe. And I did this work for 9 years, and I made approximately 2 large productions per year, sometimes on my own, focusing on dance alone, and other times in collaboration with theatre directors or actors, or working in bigger institution theatres where the choreography would be something that was maybe supporting the play. Then in 2013 I wanted to dive more specifically into choreography, and I started a PhD program in artistic research in Oslo. And this program, it's quite like a new thing in Norway, where you can research and get a PhD based on artistic work alone. So it doesn't have to be followed by a formal thesis or anything like this. It's the artistic work. So in my case, it was a number of performances, which is what gets you the PhD, and is what is validated by the assessment committee. But what is important is that the artistic practice has to be accompanied by an explicit reflection, because it's important that other colleagues in the field or other artist researchers get access to what you find out whilst researching. And I'm gonna start to talk a little bit about my project. The title of the project was Effective Choreographies, and it resulted in 6 performances altogether. I called them Hoods, Cosmic Body, Shadows of Tomorrow, State, Diorama, and Deep Field. And then I wrote a publication which was called Effective Choreographies. And if you would like to look at images or see videos from any of these works, they are all in my webpage, and I can post the address to my webpage later if you want to see something to get an idea of the aesthetic, etc. I'm gonna start to talk a little bit about affect, which was the main question for me in the research. And the background for my engagement with affect and affect theory. This was a growing interest in how choreography could move the audience on a sensorial level. And I had started to investigate what choreography could do to the audience, and how choreography could create experiences and meanings which were outside of language. And this was inspired by ideas of embodied cognition. and I'm gonna read a quote here, which is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it says, "Many features of cognition are embodied in that they are deeply dependent upon characteristics of the physical body of an agent, which play a constitutive role in that agent's cognitive processing." So, in order to unpack this a bit, this suggests, on the one hand, that the audience is capable of receiving and cognitively processing choreography through being physical, sensible, thinking bodies. That our physical experience of the world affects how we think, and that the thinking is formed by the specificity of that individual given body. So, on the other hand, embodied cognition can also be understood as the thinking that happens in the body in itself on a precognitive level. And I'm going to continue by quoting the American philosopher Graham Harman, who says, "We humans sometimes convince ourselves that knowledge is the only kind of cognitive activity worth pursuing, and thus we place a high value on knowledge, what a thing is, and practical know-how, what a thing does, while ignoring cognitive activities that do not translate as easily into literal prose terms. So, among the exceptions to this reign of knowledge, art comes immediately to mind, since the primary role of art is not to communicate knowledge about its subject matter." And although I find no interest in claiming like a primary role for art in general, because I think that can be many different things, my primary interest corresponds with the interest of Graham Harman, because it is in those embodied cognitive processes that happen in the outskirts or in the outside of language. So that I believe these processes are formative for the potentiality for effect to occur, as well as the creation of new knowledge, new ideas, new thoughts, new feelings, etc. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a backdrop to this idea of affect. It was started in what was called the affective turn, which happened in the academia in the mid-1990s, where a number of scholars started to explore ways of understanding spheres of experience which fall outside of cognition and or language. And in this, embodied cognition becomes central. And within affect theory, there are two main strands. One stems from the Canadian political philosopher who's called Brian Massumi. And for those of you who are interested in philosophy, he builds on Spinoza and Deleuze, so it's very much along those lines when talking about affect. And then the other one stems from a psychologist called Sylvan Tompkins, who speaks about the psychobiology of differential effects. And this direction is much more prevalent in post-colonial queer and feminist studies. And whilst starting my PhD research from the Massumi strand, I gradually got more biased about this approach through my work. So I will explain a little bit about what Brian Massumi sees as affect, and then I will move on to talk about how I approach this when making diorama, which is a site-specific performance that happens by the seaside. So, Brian Massumi claims that affect is an ability to affect and be affected. It's a pre-personal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another, and implying an augmentation or diminution of that body's capacity to act. And the affection is each such state considered as an encounter between the affected body and the second affecting body. So affect occurs within the change of intensity in the transition from one state to another, and prior to changes in feelings and emotions. So whilst feelings are seen as personal, that for instance you feel scared because you cognitively recognize the context as dangerous, and emotions that are seen as social, for instance you know to be sad at the funeral even if you didn't know the one who died. Masumi sees affect as something which is more abstract and even autonomous because they're prior to or outside of human consciousness and cannot be fully realized through language. And for me, this strand of affect theory, it corresponded with my interest in embodied cognition and what I have called choreography in itself and what choreography can do. And this thinking has to be seen in the context of the European contemporary dance and choreography of the 1980s and 1990s, where focus was to think about the components of a performance as semiotic categories. So they were the texts of a performance, and these different texts could be like verbal text, movement, costume, music, scenography, etc. And from around 2000, the focus of several contemporary choreographers shifted to how a performance created affect or a specific experience if produced in a particular context, instead of looking for what the different components meant and how they were symbols of something outside of themselves. And to mention a few choreographers I think have worked explicitly with this, there's the Danish choreographer Mette Ingvartsen, and there is also Swedish choreographer Morten Spångberg. And if you go a bit further back, you can see the same thing happening within the Judson Theatre in the United States in the 1960s. And for instance, the work of Yvonne Rainer is a clear example of this. Okay, so if there are some questions, you can write them, and then I will try to find them towards the end of the session and do my best to answer. I will now move on to speak about Diorama, which was a performance from 2017. And Diorama always happens by the seaside, and the idea behind the series was to stage particular views of natural or urban landscapes in various cities and contexts. And the word diorama comes from Greek, and it means through that which is seen. And the word is now often used to refer to these like three-dimensional models of landscapes that you often can see in Museum of the Natural History, for instance. And then in terms of performing arts history, it stems from work by French director Louis Daguerre from 1822, and he made something called the diorama theater, which is kind of a pre-cinematic invention where he has the audience sat watching these huge landscape paintings, a bit like what you see behind me, and then through how this was lit and how they added sound effects, the whole image would come to life, and it looked like the painting was a live image. And the theme of Diorama is to invite a meditation on well-established dichotomies, such as dead living, human, non-human, and culture, nature, through being with a given landscape and then observing the gradual changes that take place there. As a consequence, the choreography is very slow and minimal. It tries to become part of the landscape whilst at the same time drawing attention to it. And to explain a bit about how it looks, we would usually have up to 200 audience members, and they are sat along the coast in a very long line of chairs. Or sometimes we didn't do it by the coast, but it needs to be like a vast landscape that you can look out to. And then the performers are 5 performers that travel with me from Norway, and then we work also always with 10 local performers in each site. And these performers are dressed in this huge suits made from gold and silver fabric that has sequins that reflect the light. And then they are spaced out in the landscape almost as kind of glittery rocks in the landscape. And during the 50-minute duration of the performance, these will move very slowly through the landscape. And this means also that the choreography is not only about the movement of the performers, but it is sort of a choreographic assemblage which encompasses the performers, also the specificities of the landscapes, and sometimes what happens in the landscapes. So it could be birds flying past, and it could be cars or planes going by. Sometimes we would have people who just walk into the image, not realizing there's a performance going on and that they are being watched. And also things such as the wind on the faces, and maybe elements that you cannot take time to notice within contemporary life, that you are busy going from place to place, or hurrying from work, or picking up at kindergarten, I don't know, but that this performance gives some opportunity to notice stuff that is always there, but you perhaps cannot direct your attention to otherwise. And this performance inscribes itself into something called landscape dramaturgy. And I will read you a quote about landscape dramaturgy from theater scholar Ana Vujanovic, who's a Serbian theater scholar. Landscape dramaturgy is about the slow pace and not exactly the straightforward journey. I also visualize an unstructured vast panorama where I'm surrounded by things or find myself amongst physical objects, living organisms, signs, thoughts and affects as one of them. And I'm aware here that Vujanovic, she's referring to a horizon of thinking rather than to an explicit landscape. But I still think that the way she conceives of landscape dramaturgy still resonates a lot with how I was thinking in Diorama. I will tell you a little bit about the research material that I was looking into whilst making the piece, and this is often something that I would prepare it on my own first, and then I will also share some of this with the performers in order for them to also have access to the thinking behind what they are doing. I was looking into what is called the speculative turn, and this springs out of how continental philosophy of the last century understands reality as a correlate of human thought. But the speculative turn ponders the nature of reality independently of thought and humanity. So this turn tries to meet the ecological crisis, developments in neuroscience and physics, as well as the narrowing gap between human and machine. And within this, the vital materiality of Jane Bennett is particularly interesting to me. And she says that we have a habit of separating the world into matter, so it, things, this, and what she calls vibrant life, which is us or other living beings. And she claims that this hinders us from recognizing the vitality of matter, so the capacity of things. And she draws on Spinoza's notion of effect as well, and she refers broadly to the capacity that any body has for activity and for responsiveness. She sees impersonal effect or material vibrancy as something which is not a separate life force animating the matter, but instead it is inherent to materiality. So, as how I understand this is that we need to consider how all different things are working on one another. So that in the case of the diorama, the surface that the performers are on naturally affect how they move, and also that there is movement in all things. Like, for instance, I was introduced to the concept of deep time, which is geological time. So how like stone masses of the world will move through centuries and centuries. There will be small movement and change, and then of course sometimes abrupt changes with earthquakes or similar. I will move on to speak a bit more concretely about how we work in the studio. Diorama, it was initially a commission by the English live art organization called Situations, and it was led by Claire Dorothy, and Claire asked us to make something by a small swimming pool in a fishing village called Brixham, and this is placed on what they call the English Riviera, which is on the east coast of England, and I have had some previous experience with site-specific work in nature with a piece called Night Tripper from 2012, which has also toured a lot around Europe and United States. And one main kind of teaching that I took with me from Night Tripper was to not try to make the movement compete with the surroundings in regards to the audience's attention, but instead to try to create a being with or a blending in, so that all elements there have their place. And based on this idea, I made what I call dogmas for creation of diorama. So a set of rules to create diorama by. And a point of interest was to develop the being with nature. And I also created these dogmas to stop myself from deviating in rehearsal, because sometimes when I'm working with this very slow or drone-like material, it can be can get a bit impatient with it day after day. And yeah, as you can see, there's a question about sans och samling. Yeah, I will talk about diorama, and then I can talk about sans och samling afterwards. Yeah, so here were the dogmas for diorama. So one, the audience is sat and they're overlooking a panoramic view, so there's a lot to see within the horizon. The performers are placed quite far away from the audience, so 10 to 20 meters away, so that they become part of the landscape. And then the choreographic work is subtle, and it's close to blending in with the view completely. So it's quite sort of anti-spectacular in many ways. And then the performance is co-constituted with what happens in the surroundings. So the wind, the waves on the sea, the tide coming in, temperature, birds, boats, helicopters, bypassers, etc. So this is what I referred to earlier as choreography as assemblage. And also another thing is that the human performer is never directly visible in this piece. The performers are always covered with these gold and silver suits, so you will never see their faces actually. And these costumes are developed by a designer called Fredrik Floen, and these costumes make the performers into large glittery formations in the landscapes, and also because of this sequin material, it reflects light really well, so there is like a play of movement in the costume even ahead of the performers moving. These costumes, they were very crucial to how we could create movement at all, because they are heavy, there's limited visibility for the performers, so yeah, it was a challenge for them to work in this. And then I will just talk through some of the movement materials, how we kind of work to create the choreography in itself. And one principle is what I call deep time stop motion. And as mentioned before, deep time is the concept of geological time, the time of the earth. And this task was a speculation on the movement of the stone masses surrounding the swimming pool in Brixham, which in ancient times had been a seawater pool, and then in recent years humans have added concrete to the pool to make it more to hold the water better, I suppose. And the dancers I worked with, they would develop very, very slow movement phrases that we imagine to be kind of stop motion films of millions of years of this geological development. So that's kind of a fantasy task, I guess. And a second task that we worked on is something we call the wave dance. And here the performers would simply start by creating a wavy motion in their bodies, and this motion would build from almost invisible and to the largest possible, and then back down again. And then this sort of interference could keep going, and each time a new wave was initiated in the body, it would be placed differently in just one or in several body parts at the same time. And the performers can also use like different levels or planes in space. I will give an example of the third task, which is something we call the moving model. This task involved creating a fixed shape in space, which involved two or more bodies, like together as a sculpture. And then this shape would start to kind of melt out and glide through space as smoothly as possible, and then stopping to crystallize into a new fixed shape. Yeah, so these were three different examples of tasks we used to create material, and then once we had different types of material, we would work to put them into like a total composition. Then there was a question here about a performance called Sans og Samling. This was a collaboration with Signe Becker, who's scenographer, and Ingvild Langgaard, who's a composer. And Sans og Samling, it's actually a piece that was created for babies between 0 and 3 years old. And now we have also extended the piece so that it can fit up to 6 years old. We are also touring the piece to schools that have kids with special needs. So that could be different types of abilities, and so that's independent of age. And this piece features 2 dancers and 1 technician. And then there's another question from Sagar. Currently I'm working on a new project called Spectral, and Spectral is going to premiere on the 1st of September here in Oslo in Dansens Hus. And Spectral is based around a large installation of different types of fabrics, and it features 6 performers from very different backgrounds. Some of them are trained in dance, some are trained in performance and acting. And we are together trying to make a landscape which moves and changes throughout. So it is kind of maybe the next step from diorama, but this new piece is made for inside, so it will be performed in black box spaces and also in white cubes in gallery spaces. Yeah, there's a question from Jaydev. You were never interested in regular choreography. You developed a special interest to associate with this kind of dance styles. Yeah, I mean, I think my approach to choreography, although I have trained as a dancer in more traditional contemporary dance styles, I was quite quickly drawn to the type of choreography that relates perhaps more to visual arts approach of working. So it can be very, very minimal and quite, the focus is a lot on the visual. But I did also make some pieces that have quite a lot of dance movement in a more conventional sense. So, for instance, in my webpage there is a video from a piece called State from 2016, and this is more of a dance piece. It is a study in different ritual dances from different parts of the world. So this is, if you want to look into something that has more movement, I would recommend that one. Yeah, if there are any other questions, I would be happy to answer. And if someone is interested in reading the writing I did for my PhD, I'm happy to make this available as a PDF through the webpage of Coconut Theatre. I can arrange this with Jaydev after the session. So I will just hold on a few minutes if there are some more questions, and if not, I think my time is out. So I would like to thank you all for listening and for commenting, and a big thanks to Jaydev and to Coconut Theatre to present me in your channel. Yeah. JDev is commenting that there was a video on my website where a group of dancers continuously running, and this is the piece where I collaborated with Sudesh Adana, who put me in touch with JDev. And yeah, this performance, the dancers are running, there are 5 dancers, and they are running in circles for an hour, a full hour, and these circles are gradually changing in the room, and the effect on the audience is this quite sort of hypnotizing or meditative state, or, you know, unless people get very bored, because this this happens of course too, but for the people who like the style, I think it can be quite hypnotizing experience. In terms of sound, I often work with the composers, so I worked several times with a composer called Lasse Marhaug, and he is a noise artist from Norway. And also I'm working now with Camilla Vatne Barratue, and she's also a great composer. I will share my web address. I can comment when we post this video on the Facebook page of Coconut Theatre, and then you can go and look at the videos and pictures and stuff. And yeah, as I mentioned, I can also make available the PhD writing as a PDF if someone wants to have a look. Oh yeah, if I've been to India. No, I haven't been to India, but I would love to go to India. I've seen any Indian local dance forms. I have, maybe I'm pronouncing this wrongly, but I've been watching online a dance from Manipuri Priestess, which is kind of based a lot around arm movements. And then I know the work of Sudesh Adana, and he's also a friend of and colleague. And then I have performed in a festival with the performer and the director Malika Taneja, who is based in India as well. And we performed together in a festival in Italy last summer. She performed a solo called Be Careful, and I think this piece has also been touring in India. So my performances, they mainly have toured in Europe and in North America, but there is one piece called Cosmic Body from 2015 that toured to China, to 3 different cities in China in 2017. But apart from that, I haven't traveled to Asia with the work. Okay, so I think if there are more questions, you can please just write, and I will try my best to answer. I have not tried to learn any Indian dance techniques, but where I studied in Leeds, one former student of the school was Akram Khan, who's I think he's from India originally, or maybe it's his parents who are from India, and he is very touring a lot with his work around Europe, and it's based around Kathak styles, and then he's merging the Kathak with the different contemporary styles, or the style that he himself developed. And yeah, I've seen his work several times. Thank you very much to Coconut Theatre for hosting this session, and thank you all for watching and for sending your questions. Bye bye bye.